When did you get started playing guitar?
I first had the idea of playing the guitar. I can actually remember the first moment, which was I was 8 years old. It was the August of 1960, and I was in the family car with my mother and my father in the front seat, and I was sitting in the back seat with my two sisters. I have an older sister and a younger sister. And we were at the corner of Mott Avenue and 23rd Street. I actually remember the moment. We were stopped for a red light. It was an August morning. It was a beautiful day. We were going to the beach. We went to the beach every day. We lived in Far Rockaway, New York, and we were going to the Seacliff Beach Club in Atlantic Beach. And my mother turned around and said, "Your father and I have decided that it's time for you to learn to play a musical instrument." And I was an avid comic book reader at the time, and I actually remember a cartoon bubble appearing over my head. I imagined that with a guitar in it. It was like totally the only thought I ever had in terms of playing an instrument was guitar. Now, partly 1960, Elvis Presley and rock and roll, early rock and roll with all the guitar playing, and I had two older cousins who were teenagers who were in bands who played guitar. So I never had any other thought about it. And that's how I got started. And I actually, the few weeks later, it was September 1960, my father brought me down to at the community center where there was a beginner's guitar class. I think I was probably the youngest person there. And it was a 6-week class, and I remember at the end of the last class, my father wasn't there yet to pick me up, and everybody was walking out, and I went up to the teacher. I was extremely serious about it, and I don't remember what the question was, but I had a question for the teacher. And I remember walking up, and I was so serious, and my father walked in, and he saw how serious I was, and I just remember he smiled, he laughed. My father had played music earlier in his life. So that's how I began.
So when did you make the switch to 8-string guitars and classical guitar?
Well, classical guitar was fairly early on. I was in this beginner's class, and then I had about 9 months of folk guitar lessons with what I remember was a beautiful young lady. She was 19 years old. Her name was Jane, and she was a beatnik, an actual beatnik wore the beret and the whole thing, and she gave me folk guitar lessons. And again, I'm this serious young student, always loved guitar, and I think about 9 months after starting, and anybody listening to this can make pregnant jokes, she told my parents there wasn't anything else she could teach me. I learned to play this. I remember the sloop of the John B, or the sloop John B. That there's a folk song which had a calypso strum, which actually wound up being extremely helpful to me about 7 years later when I got into rhythm and blues band, but that's for later. And I just learned folk songs, and she suggested to my parents that I take classical guitar lessons, that she knew of a retired gentleman in town who gave classical guitar lessons. And so I started classical, and so then I was probably like, I was about getting to be 9 years old, and I did that for about a year. And I remember playing Bach, playing some of the, one of the cello minuets, the minuet from the 6th cello suite, indeed, but not, a simplified version of that, and various other small pieces that I played. And I had the Segovia scales. He was a Segovia file. He had photos of Andre Segovia on the wall, and also he was an amateur guitar maker. He was an amateur luthier, and he would have guitars in process down in his workshop, which was fascinating to me. I mean, and it's actually, that has something to do with what we'll talk about later with all the guitars that I've made, because I've gotten very involved with builders in the process of making, especially an 8-string guitar, and I do a lot of work on my own guitar. So that was those were very early influences, which counted for a lot. But after about a year of that, I didn't want to practice so much. I didn't want to play scales, and I didn't want to play classical. I was pulled to classical music because at the end of my freshman year, I met a professor named Richard Dyer Bennett, Now, I think I sent you the information. He became my mentor. There was recently a biography written about him. I think it's called The Last Minstrel. And there's one chapter about his years at Stony Brook, and I'm part of that. I was interviewed for that chapter, and the author of the book actually asked me to write an afterword about Dyer Bennett's guitar playing, because Richard Dyer Bennett was a folk singer, but he was really a minstrel. And he played guitar. He had a really good, when I was there, a really good 1957 Velasquez guitar. And I met him at the end of my freshman year and actually got involved in a course that he taught, which was called Voice Training for Singers and Actors. But he used the guitar in that class, and I wound up becoming his teaching assistant. And the biggest influence he had on me is that at the end of my freshman year, I came in to meet, I'd heard about this guy who had a really great guitar, a Velasquez guitar, and that he did really great arranging of the songs that he sang for his guitar accompaniment. I wanted to meet him. And the first meeting I had with him at the end of my freshman year, I remember knocking on his door. He opened the door. I had my guitar with me. He said, "Look, I just have 5 minutes, but come in. We'll talk a little bit." And we hit it off so well. I mean, that first meeting was 90 minutes. And then he eventually just had to go and everything. But I took out my guitar, did some playing. I saw his Velasquez. And I was mostly, again, playing these folk and folk rock type of music, fingerstyle, some of my own pieces. And he looked at me and he said, "Andrew, do you know the Segovia scales?" And I did recall them. He said, "Why don't you take a look at that again? And do you know that little Bach prelude in D minor, which we know is BWV 999, which I sort of knew." And he's the one actually, that one meeting got me back into classical guitar. I wound up auditioning a year later. It wasn't until a year later, but at the end of my sophomore year, I realized that I really wanted to be a music major. And I didn't read that well, and I didn't have that much of a background, and I had to audition to get in. This is kind of funny. Some of this stuff, I hadn't thought of this in years. The audition was for the violist on the faculty, because we didn't have a guitar teacher on the faculty. And I had not really started, even at that time. Dyer Bennett got me into that stuff, but I was working on my own, and I had worked up, I remember Carcassi number 3 in A major, and that Bach D minor prelude, and I knew some of the Segovia scales. And in the audition, that's all I knew in terms of repertoire. I was still playing a lot of folk pop music. In the audition, you had to play 2 pieces and a scale. So I walked in, I didn't tell him it was the only 2 pieces I knew. And I played it, and I played them musically, and I played them pretty cleanly. And the guy looked at me and said, "You know, I'm going to give you a pass. We're going to accept you as a music major into our program." But I just had this hunch something funny is going on here. He was absolutely right. Something funny was going on. I didn't know any other stuff. So I got into the music major program, which I started actually at the beginning of my junior year. And it was really a 4-year program that I wound up doing in 2.5 years. I had to stay 1 extra semester just to take for certain course requirements.